And now on to today's presentation with Dr. Peter Pry. The electrical grid is crucial to business continuity, the economy, national existence, and personal survival. This briefing will explain why the electrical grid is the keystone critical infrastructure, how it operates, and the wide range of natural and man-made threats to which the electrical grid is increasingly vulnerable. It is possible to protect the grid cost effectively, but governments and utilities are slow to act. Accordingly, business owners can and should lead the way by protecting their assets, themselves, and their families from the looming prospect of a protracted blackout of the electrical grid and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Peter Pry, who, as John mentioned, is the Executive Director of the Emp Task Force on National and Homeland Security, a 501c3 nonprofit congressional advisory board dedicated to achieving protection of the United States from electromagnetic pulse, cyber attack, mass destruction, and other threats to civilian infrastructure on an accelerated basis. Dr. Pry was also Director of the United States Nuclear Strategy Forum, an advisor on, an advisory board to Congress on policies to counter weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Pry has an illustrious career with the CIA and has written many books that were listed in the Eventbrite invitation. On a side note, I'd like to point out that the Emp Task Force was partially set up because US intelligence noticed that the North Koreans had 2 satellites circling the globe over North America, and that these satellites did nothing. They weren't reconnaissance satellites, they weren't communication satellites. And then the Russians confirmed that they actually sold EMP weapons technologies to the North Koreans that would fit inside satellites that decades ago. And just before this call, Dr. Pry mentioned that if something like that were ever to be set off above North America, it would wipe out all of our IT systems, our finance systems, transports, trucks, cars, you name it, air conditioning, refrigerators. And the death toll would be catastrophic, on the order of 90% of the population in 12 months. And although that's not the topic of today's subject and presentation, if anyone's interested in learning more about that, by all means, do let us know, and maybe we could have Dr. Pry back another day. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Pry to speak about the conventional threats to our grid and what we as business owners and individuals can do to protect ourselves. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for being here today to talk about the threats to the grid and what can be done about it. For 20 years, senior scientists and intelligence officers and strategists in the United States have been trying to convince the Washington bureaucracy, to educate the Washington bureaucracy on the centrality of the electric grid to national security, and that protecting the grid is a national security issue because the electric power grid is the keystone critical infrastructure. And what do I mean when I say a keystone critical infrastructure? It is the infrastructure upon which all other life-sustaining critical infrastructures depend. You know, the electric grid is to our electronic civilization what aqueducts and roads were to the classic civilization of ancient Rome. You know, they couldn't exist and you couldn't sustain the Roman Empire without roads and aqueducts to feed the populations in the cities. And today, we couldn't sustain our modern electronic civilization without the electric grid. Everything depends directly or indirectly upon it. Water, for example, you know, it takes vast quantities of electricity to provide pure water to our cities. Food, the transportation and the growing and the collection of food depends directly and indirectly upon electricity. There's only a 30-day food supply to feed the population of North America. In the United States, our population is 330 million people. And that is made possible, that large population, because of the electric grid in our high-tech society. You know, when the first electric grid was first turned on back in the 1880s, you know, the population of the United States was 60 million people. From 60 million then till 330 million people today. You know, and we don't have the 19th century critical infrastructure, steam-powered locomotives, a horse-drawn agricultural economy, a farm market economy to feed the cities. That doesn't exist anymore. So the EMP Commission on which I served warned and calculated that if we were to lose the electric grid, the population might well fall below what we had in the 19th century, and that we could lose 90% of the population in 1 year from a catastrophic influence on the electric grid. Now, why are business people interested in that? Well, you are part of the society. You want your businesses to continue. You want your families to survive, and and protecting the grid is of interest in a positive way as well, because energy security is increasingly, I'm sure, and where the U.S. government and the Defense Department are concerned, and where international businesses are concerned, it's becoming a major consideration, the reliability of the electric grid to provide power. So if Canada, for example, were to protect its grid, and so it were safer than the United States, international businesses would find that more attractive. And, in terms of relocating to Canada, and it would obviously be better for the survival of the Canadian people and for your economy. Now, we don't have a lot of time here, so let's go to the next view graph and talk about, we'll whip through some of the threats to the grid. And I said that for 20 years, we've been trying to convince Washington, and finally we have succeeded, because in the past couple of years, the Congress and the White House have both passed bills and executive orders to try on an accelerated basis to start protecting our grid from the variety of threats that were listed earlier on the first part of the view graph: severe weather, physical sabotage, cyber attacks, and electromagnetic pulse. And the worst of these threats, the nightmare one, the one that is many people regard as least likely, but it would be the worst, would be what is called a nuclear electromagnetic pulse attack. This can be conducted by any nation that has a nuclear weapon. North Korea is one of our greatest concerns, as it was mentioned by Karsten in the beginning. The EMP Commission has warned about these 2 North Korean satellites that are orbiting at an altitude of 400 kilometers over North America. They pass over us several times today. And what these rings on this map depict is the size of the electromagnetic field that would be generated, the destructive electromagnetic field, by a single weapon detonated at that altitude. The outer ring is the EMP field you would get from one of those North Korean satellites, for example, orbiting in an altitude of 400 kilometers. Note that it covers all 48 contiguous United States, most of Canada, and a good chunk of Mexico. And everything within that field would be at risk. The electric grid would certainly go down, but airplanes, cars, all kinds of electronics, anything the size of the personal computer on your desk could be destroyed by this electromagnetic pulse. And the inner circle, the one at 30 kilometers, the smallest circle, that field could be generated by a nuclear weapon lofted by a meteorological balloon, for example, or a jet doing a zoom climb, or a short-range ballistic missile launched off a freighter. That's what the ring that you see on the outside, the purple ring over the Buffalo, New York, Washington, D.C. area, that's a scenario where if Iran had a short-range ballistic missile, or the North Koreans had a short-range ballistic missile launched off a freighter, and it just went to 30 kilometers, that's the kind of field that could be put down. The view graph is a little misleading because the damage wouldn't be limited to the area of the EMP field. Once you start destroying the dozens of extra high voltage transformers and SCADAs within that damaging electrical field, the destructive results will cascade far beyond the field. We were talking before about the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, which started in the state of Ohio because a tree branch came in contact with a high power line, and it set in motion a series of cascading failures that resulted putting the whole Northeast and the eastern United States into blackout, 50 million people, okay? So just imagine if a tree branch could do that, what would happen if you had even a limited EMP attack that basically took out all
failure on the grid
in the region of Buffalo and New York and Washington? It would cause cascades all through the North American grid, which is what this is depicted here. This is the North American grid. We're all on the same grid, the United States and Canada, and this is how the grid is organized. There's an eastern grid, a Texas grid, and a western grid. The most important of these grids is the eastern grid, because that's where most of the population for both the United States and Canada, we live off of that grid. And if all the bad guys did, or if a phenomena like a EMP from a geomagnetic storm happened, which is what Canada experienced in 1989, the Hydroquebec storm, that put the eastern grid in Canada into blackout in just 90 seconds. Let's go to the next view graph. Next, thank you. This just shows, how the grid architecture works. On the left, you've got the generating facility. Those boxes are transformers that take the electricity from the plant and spin it up to hundreds of thousands of volts. A typical extra high voltage transformer can carry 500,000 to 750,000 volts, and it sends it down the line. And then there are extra high voltage transformers that step that power down, and it goes down and down so it can be consumed locally. On the right hand side of the screen, you'll see these telephone poles with the little black, you can go outside of your house, I'm sure you see these in places you live, these little black cylinders that are up on power line phones or telephone poles. That's a transformer. So you're going from these enormous transformers that are the size of a house and weigh hundreds of tons, in some cases thousands of tons, and it gets scaled down, stepped down, the power gets stepped down so that those little transformers can then power your house. That's how the electricity goes from being, say, 750,000 volts coming out of the generator down to the 110 volts that you use in your home. Next view graph. Next. Here's an example of an extra high voltage transformer. All right, we've still got the extra high volt, okay. This is to our civilization what aqueducts and roads were to the Roman Empire. This is what makes electronic civilization possible, the extra high voltage transformer. These things weigh hundreds of tons. They have to be custom made. You can't mass produce them. Each transformer has to be made by hand, basically, to serve a unique purpose in that part of the grid. There's 2,000 of these transformers in the North American grid. That includes the United States and Canada. Let's go to the next view graph. And these transformers are vulnerable to all kinds of threats. They can be destroyed by sabotage, by bad guys using high-powered rifles or rocket-propelled grenade launchers. A nuclear EMP attack could destroy them. Non-nuclear EMP weapons could destroy them, and Mother Nature can destroy them. This is on the left, you have a satellite photograph of what happened during the 1989 Hydroquebec geomagnetic storm. This isn't a great geomagnetic storm. This was a more severe one than usual, but it caused Quebec to lose electric power for 9 hours, and it caused damage in the United States too. One of our big transformers at a nuclear power plant in Salem, New Jersey, one of the extra high voltage transformers, you can see in the photograph in the center of the screen that in 90 seconds, the coils were melted. It melted the coils. Imagine the energy that was required to do that. This transformer is designed to carry 750,000 volts, okay? And in 90 seconds, the energy that Next view graph, please. Okay, let's move on to that. We're running out of time. Here's an example of a non-nuclear EMP weapon. It's actually not a weapon. It's a diagnostic device. It's used making airports so that the radars are spaced far enough away from the landing strips so that the electronics from the radar don't burn out the electronics inside of an airplane. Or if you want to put heavy electronic machinery, heavy electronic equipment on a factory floor, how far apart do you have to space it so it doesn't burn out? It's not intended to be used as a weapon. It's intended to be used as a tool, a peaceful diagnostic tool for protecting against electromagnetic transients. But it puts out 100,000 volts per meter, and the power of this thing is shown right in the advertisement for it. Anybody can buy it, and you don't need a license to buy this, but it could be used basically as a weapon of mass destruction, that's for sale to anybody who's got the money. If you bought one of these EMP suitcases, it can be run by a single individual. It's light enough to be carried by a single individual. It's packaged in a suitcase, so it looks just like it's in a suitcase. If you were to put this in the trunk of your car and drive the car over to one of those extra high voltage transformers, and those transformers are unprotected. I mean, you see them all the time when you drive down the highway and you pass under high voltage power lines. Off in the distance, you'll usually see, a chain link fence, and there's a bunch of boxes inside the chain link fence. Those are the EHV transformers. And if you were just to back your car up and just sit there with this thing turned on until you started seeing sparks and flames come out of the transformers, you'd be able to basically black out a whole city just by yourself using this device. And if you had a team of people running around the country taking out transformers, you wouldn't need to take out very many transformers until you could black out the whole of North America. In fact, if you knew out of the 2,000 extra high voltage transformers we have in the country, if you knew which 9 to attack, you could black out all of North America for a year. Next view graph. In addition to the extra high voltage transformers, the other piece of technology that is critical to our survival as electronic civilization are called SCADAs, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems. And these are small, they're the size of a personal computer. They basically regulate the way electricity flows into transformers. They regulate the way, and they're present everywhere in our society. They run traffic control systems. Stoplights are run by SCADAs. The way water flows through a pipe is run by SCADAs. The way natural gas flows through pipes is run by SCADAs. And these things are particularly vulnerable to EMP effects, nuclear and non-nuclear EMP effects. They're also the way you can take out the electric grid by cyber warfare. If you can get a cyber bug into these SCADAs and damage the way they operate, you can basically black the grid out that way. Let's go to the next view graph. We know how to protect against this, and we can do it cost effectively. There are blocking devices and surge arresters and Faraday cages that can be used to protect against all of these threats we've been talking about, whether it's EMP or physical sabotage or cyber attacks. So we know how to do it. The question is having the political will to do it. And it doesn't even cost that much to do it. Let's go to the next view graph. On the right, we have an extra high voltage transformer with a surge arrestor installed. On the left, that little thing is the surge arrestor. The picture on the far left is a close-up of what a surge arrestor looks like. These are not hypothetical devices. They actually exist now and can be purchased and installed on extra high voltage transformers, and they would basically provide protection against the whole range of threats that we've been talking about. Next view graph. This briefing was aimed at the United States. It was actually prepared for the Texas State Legislature. And in the briefing, I was urging Texas, as I would urge Canada, not to wait for Washington to solve the problem. Here are a number of bills that were passed in the United States to protect the electric grid, including the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, the SHIELD Act, the Grid Reliability Act. But in addition to that, we have a number of executive orders that have come out of the White House to protect against EMP and cyber attacks and physical sabotage. And Congress has passed other bills as well. The problem in getting the electric grid protected, though, is not technical, and it doesn't have to do with the cost. We know how to protect the grid. We've known for 50 years how to protect electronics against worse threats, because the Department of Defense has been doing it clandestinely, for 50 years. That information used to be highly classified, but after we convinced people that you need to protect electric grids and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures, that information became declassified. And so now we've been trying to play catch up with the Russians and Chinese, who have protected their electric grids and critical infrastructures from threats like this. The problem is at least in the United States, the biggest problem has been political, and it's not technical, and it's not a matter of the cost. We have 3,000 electric utilities here in the United States, and they're a powerful lobby, and they don't want to do anything. And so they have like $150 million a year to spread around in lobbying to try to convince Congress and the regulatory agencies to let them off the hook so that they don't have to basically protect themselves. That worked for a long time, but it's not working now. Now we are making big progress because of the executive orders and the bills from Congress in the direction that we should be going in. But will it happen in time? It's because of those 3,000 utilities and the cozy relationship the utilities have with certain key congressional committees, like the energy committees. They make big donations to the chairman of the energy committees. They can still slow things up. It would be in the interests of both Canada and the United States if Canada took the initiative to protect its grid. And businessmen can be, I think, very influential with your government to persuade them to do that. Canada has a big advantage over the United States in being able to protect its electric grid and other critical infrastructures, because 80% of your electricity comes from hydropower, which is the most resilient, easiest to protect form of producing energy. Your second biggest source of electricity is from nuclear power plants. And after hydropower, that's the next most resilient form of electricity. That's not the case in the United States. We rely on forms of electricity for generation, like natural gas, and that is not as resilient as hydropower and not as resilient as nuclear. So the mix of our sources of generating energy makes us more vulnerable than you are. So it would be less costly and faster and easier for Canada to protect itself. That would help the United States. And also the relationship that your government has with your utilities is, shall we say, the utilities seem to be less able to manipulate, your political system. They tend to, your political system, at least in my perception, is, that in a better position to be able to tell NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, that they've got to do certain things in Canada in order to protect the Canadian grid. NERC oversees not just Canada, but the United States too. So if you made a political breakthrough in Canada, that would benefit us down in the States as well and help us get our grid protected. Moreover, if the Canadian grid were able to survive an EMP or a cyber attack or physical sabotage by some adversary, it would, and even if the United States went down, if the lights stood on in Canada, it would make it easier for us to bring back the United States electric grid. So it would be in your interest, the interest of the United States, the interest of Canada, in the collective interests of all of us who live in North America and live off of the North American grid, if the business community became activist and said, look, it doesn't cost that much and it's going to be relatively easy to take the simple steps that are necessary to protect our electric grid. not wait for Washington to try to solve this problem. We can do it on our own, and we can do it quickly. And that's why I'm appealing to you today to protect your business, protect your families, protect your country, and protect North America by becoming activists. Become what I call EMP warriors. Of course, EMP isn't the only threat. We're also talking about physical sabotage and severe weather, including geomagnetic storms. Oh, I failed to mention, but when the 1989 Hydroquebec storm is just a small example of probably the worst threat that could happen to the electric grid, because there is this thing called the geomagnetic superstorm or solar superstorm that comes out of the sun, and they happen every century, once every century, every 150 years. The last and most powerful of them that we know of was the Carrington event in 1859. In 1859, we were not yet an electronic civilization, but we were on the cusp of becoming one, because telegraph systems existed on every continent except Antarctica. And everywhere in the world, the telegraph systems were basically destroyed by the powerful natural electromagnetic pulse that was generated by the 1859 Carrington event. There was another solar superstorm in 1921 called the Railroad Storm. It was 1/10 the size of the Carrington event. Again, we weren't an electronic civilization in 1921. That didn't really happen until the 1930s, when electrification of both Canada and the United States really began in earnest. But the 1921 storm was bad enough that it basically caused electronics to fail all across North America and in some parts of Europe. So we were narrowly missed by a geomagnetic superstorm in a few years ago. July 23rd, I think it was, I don't recall the year. I remember the date. It was July 23rd. I don't think it was 2013. But you know, it wasn't that long ago. And the coronal mass ejection passed across the path of the Earth and missed us just by 3 days, Now, based on these events, NASA has estimated that the likelihood of a recurrence of a solar superstorm is 12% per decade. 12% per decade. It's a very high risk. That virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes, or the latest, that of our grandchildren, we will get hit for sure with a solar superstorm that can potentially black out the entire world. So we need to be getting ready for that phenomena, which is going to be inevitable. And by the clock in the clubhouse wall, I see I'm out of time here, so I'm going to suspend my remarks and open it up for questions and answers. Thank you for coming and attending, and hopefully you'll become part of the solution to this existential threat to our civilization.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Pry. That was very interesting, very thought-provoking, and EMP warriors. That's what you'd like us to become. That's the action item, and get involved with the solution. So thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. We do have a number of questions, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to call on anybody that has a question in the chat box just to sort of express it. This is a good time to get your questions into the chat box because we are going to wrap up promptly at 10. But I'd like to call on Jeff Charlton first, and as I call on people, maybe you could just a brief introduction, self-intro, and then state your question to Dr. Pry. And after Jeff, I'm going to go to you, Chuck Hamilton. So just so you're aware. So Jeff, over to you first for your question of Dr. Pry.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great presentation, Dr. Pry. By way of introduction, my name is Jeff Charlton, and I run a firm called FlexServe. We become the in-house accounting and HR for small and mid-sized enterprise. I do remember that electrical storm very well, and for us, it lasted more than 9 hours. We were out for a couple of days without power. My question to you is, if we were to protect the Canadian grid, as you've recommended, and I think it's great advice, because we're integrated with the US electrical grid, would it be sufficient for us, would we be protected if we protected our Canadian facilities, given that we're connected to the US facilities?
Yes, it would. As a matter of fact, you're already a little bit better protected than the North American grid because of the 1989 Hydroquebec storm. In the aftermath of that storm, Canada did take steps to improve the survivability of its transformers and SCADA systems. I think you raised the hardness of the grid to, this is a technical term, but it's called 8 volts per kilometer. That was the power of the field that was generated by the 1989 Hydro-Quebec storm. The United States didn't do that. And then when the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003 came along, which was started in Ohio, as I mentioned, the falling tree branch in Ohio, our grid was so fragile that it rippled all the way through the Northeast and put 50 million Americans into blackout, including New York City. People had to walk home across the Brooklyn Bridge to get home because the subways weren't running. But if you look at the satellite photographs from the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, it penetrated only in a little way into Canada. It didn't take out the whole, eastern part of Canada, as it probably would have had you not already taken steps to harden yourself a little bit. So in a way, the 1989 Hydro-Quebec storm turned out to be a bit of a blessing for Canada. And it also proves that if you protect yourselves, you can isolate yourself from a catastrophe if it happens in the United States. Basically, it's called islanding. Canada can, in effect, island its grid, by raising the protection. I think that the standard, the real standard to protect, for example, against a Carrington event, a recurrence of a Carrington-class geomagnetic superstorm, instead of protecting their grid to 8 volts per kilometer, they should protect it against 24 volts per kilometer. If they did that, then they'd be safe against any solar storm and most of the other threats that could happen. And, that would keep the lights on in Canada. And if the United States is foolish enough because of its political problems that it still is unprotected, you guys could come to our rescue, which is my chief reason for talking to Canadians about this.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pry, for that. And Chuck Hamilton, I'm going to come to you for your question, and then I'm going to go to you, John Frangella, after we hear from Chuck.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Pry. My name is Chuck Hamilton. I'm the president and CEO of a company called Educators Financial Group. We provide financial services to education workers in Ontario. A few of the examples you used that caused these recent blackouts were related to climate change. Is there any coordination of your efforts with the climate change lobby group? And are you seeing an increasing frequency of climate events causing disruptions to the grid? Thank you.
Well, I can't really think of examples where I'm a climate change skeptic myself. All right. Looking at the science for that, climate change does happen, but the kind of catastrophic climate change that a lot of people are talking about, I just don't think the science supports it. I don't think that we're going to be facing an existential threat from climate change in 12 years. And I can't really think of examples of electric grid blackouts or anything that have resulted from what we would term as climate change. Nonetheless, I have reached out, even though I and some of the climate change organizations, we have disagreements on that science. We both do have concerns about the natural threat from the sun, and I've tried to make common cause with some of the climate change type organizations. Unfortunately, one of the problems we've had in terms of being able to make progress is some of the forms of energy, at least in the United States, that the climate change people want to go away, like coal-fired plants, for example. All right. Coal happens to be one of the more resilient forms of electrical energy. And the United States depends upon that a lot more than Canada does for getting this electricity. So there we are at loggerheads. An area where I think we could have some agreement is in nuclear power. While nuclear, for some reason, isn't popular with a lot of the climate change people. But if you were really serious about climate change and you really believe that climate change was an existential threat, it seems to me that you'd be that nuclear power would be the way to go, because it doesn't have it's got the smallest carbon footprint of any other source of energy except for hydropower. Even solar power, actually has a pretty big carbon footprint when you take a look at what is necessary to manufacture the solar plants and all the rest. But the short answer is I've tried to make common cause with the climate change people, and there has been some.
Yeah, Dr. Pry, if you could maybe kick your feedback.
But maybe it'd be more successful than I've been in trying to make alliance with the climate change groups.
Thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Pry. And we've got about 6 or 7 questions lined up. I'd love to get to them all. So if we can, then we got about maybe 10 minutes to get them in. So if we can go into a rapid fire questions and rapid fire answers, that would be terrific. I would like to get to everybody who has a question. So John Frangella, just quick self intro and question to Dr. Pry, and then we'll get on to the next question as soon as we can. Thank you.
Hello, Peter. Hello, everyone. This is John Frangella, Pro 3000. We're an advanced manufacturing facility. My question is, what can we do to somehow kind of have an insurance policy by having, if a solar flare does happen and affects the power grid or any other, the 5 other possibilities, by having, units, what can we do to protect ourselves in that, survival moment if it does happen? Like, I've heard putting walkie-talkies in an aluminum box. I don't know if that's going to do anything, but what do you think as business owners we should do?
Well, the best solution is to have the grid not go down in the first place, which is why I would encourage you to have your government, harden the grid. It wouldn't cost that much in order to protect the U.S. grid. We can actually protect those 2,000 transformers and the generators. It would only cost about $4 billion to do that. $4 billion, okay, to protect the electric grid from going down. That's what we used to give away in foreign aid to Pakistan every year. However, if you are also skeptical of government, okay, as I am, a lot of Americans and communities can do things to protect themselves. Have an emergency generator. All right. Most of the emergency generators already come in a metal box that is basically designed similar to a Faraday cage. I'd have an emergency generator. I would keep it on manual and there's a little button, a control on the generator, so you can have it automatic or manual. You should have it on manual, because if it's on automatic, it would enable a pulse to come right through the power lines and get it into the generator and potentially damage it. But if it's on manual, then you've created a break. You've broken the generator, so that it's not connected to the wiring in your house or your business until such time as you need to use it. Have a food supply. Prepare the way you would for any protracted crisis. Have a food supply. Have a water supply. Have a medicine kit and know how to use it. Yes, you can make a makeshift Faraday cage using a metal garbage can. A metal garbage can with a tight-fitting lid. If you put your communications equipment inside of a plastic bag so that it doesn't touch the sides of the can, it will be serviceable and it would mitigate the EMP effects. It's also not true, by the way, that modern cars have to be vulnerable to EMP because of all the microelectronics. It would only cost the material cost of hardening an automobile. You can get from any electronics stores ferrite tubes, all right? And if you hired a mechanic to have install ferrite tubes on the long wires in your engine compartment, that would significantly increase the survivability of any car, even a modern car, against an EMP effect. So there are things that you can do even as individuals to prepare for this, as well as businesses. If your business involves data and computers and things of that sort, there are Faraday cages that are available on the market for your computers and for your data storage systems that would protect them against any EMP. And they don't cost that much. So there are a lot of things that individual businesses can do to protect themselves, even if the government can't be persuaded to do the right thing. And I would encourage people to go ahead and do that and start being protected on their own, to do what they could to prepare for the worst.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, very good. Because of the number of questions, I'm gonna read a couple of these questions, Peter, and just some quick answers would be great. So, a question from Brennan Schmidt: Elon Musk is big on electric vehicles, power walls, and distributed models of power. Do you foresee us using civilian infrastructure as a backup? That's the question from Brennan.
Well, I'm pretty sure that here in the United States, all the infrastructures are civilian. The electric grid is privately owned, the 3,000 different utilities, and that's been kind of part of the problem. But you can buy, I think that's an expensive solution to use Musk's batteries. I think a much less expensive solution would be to get a standard kind of generator that you can buy, from any hardware store, and that would probably provide backup. But yes, I would encourage people to provide for their own electricity and to be prepared for all of these events. It doesn't cost that much to do it. And the more you think about what you need and where you are and what your circumstances are, the less money you have to spend and the less preparation that you have to undertake. So the short answer to that question is yes. I think the more individual citizens are prepared, the less government has to do, and the more you can come to the aid of your neighbors. You might even consider it an ethical imperative that those of us who can afford to protect ourselves really might have an obligation to do so that not only are we taking care of our families, but that we're in a position to help the larger society.
Yeah, good. Thank you. We have a question from Stuart Wright. What are your thoughts on the ERPI EMP report, and how can energy regulators be better informed by appropriate mitigation approaches, investments to address the real risk and impact to critical infrastructure?
The EPRI report is bogus. That EPRI report stands for the Electric Power Research Institute. It was when the EMP Commission was around, we called in EPRI. They didn't want to come and talk to us because they know the report was bogus. The people who wrote that report are not experts on EMP. EPRI is basically a lobby. It's a paid so-called think tank for the electric power industry. If you go back far enough in EPRI's history, as a matter of fact, you'll find there was a time when EPRI was arguing that EMP wasn't even a real phenomenon and it didn't exist. I would also add that EPRI is untrustworthy because much of their research budget comes from foreign countries. Russia and China are members in good standing of EPRI. EPRI officers a couple of years ago received a medal from Communist China for their work on advising the United States on protecting electric grids, which is basically the direction that EPRI goes. Is if you believe the EPRI reports, that the threats from EMP are so benign that we basically don't have to do anything. And we basically should leave well enough alone and not do what Russia and China have done to protect their electric grids from EMP. Frankly, I suspect that that EPRI is could actually be part of a foreign disinformation operation to try to persuade our policymakers to do the wrong thing and to leave our electric grids vulnerable. That's what I think about the EPRI report. And I've written a whole book, by the way, called Blackout. The new book is called The Power and the Light. I and the U.S. Air Force Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, you can actually look up the U.S. Air Force EDTF, the U.S. Air Force Electromagnetic Defense Task Force. They have an excellent rebuttal of the EPRI report showing that really they expose that these aren't even honest mistakes the way EPRI does its analysis. They actually catch them red-handed, engaging in intellectually dishonest analysis in their reports. So they're completely untrustworthy. Don't trust anything that comes out of the Electric Power Research Institute, the Edison Electric Institute, or NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. all of these basically are lobbies for the electric power industry, and they are no more to be trusted than the cigarette industry independent laboratory assessments from the 1950s that assured us there was no causal linkage between smoking and lung cancer.
Thank you for that. Lou has a question. He'd like to know your thoughts on William Fortune's 1 Second After, an additional 2 volumes, thought-provoking, reflecting reality, question mark?
Right. Well, Bill Fortune is a friend, but I've always had mixed feelings about his novel. I mean, his novel is excellent. His novel has done more than the EMP Commission reports have, I think, to educate people about the threat from EMP. So, you know, I do encourage people to read Bill Fortune's novel. Unfortunately, Fortune's novel has been abused and misused by some people on the left who have claimed that, you know, that the EMP Commission's existential threat assessments were derived from Bill Fortune's novel, which is just the opposite. What happened was the EMP Commission did its reports, and Newt Gingrich, who's a friend of Bill Fortune, wanted some user-friendly means of educating the American people on the EMP threat. People learn more from their entertainments these days than they do from reading technical reports. And so that's why Fortune wrote his novel. But yeah, I mean, 1 Second After is a good novel, you know, and Fortune based his research on the findings of the EMP Commission. I've lost you. I'm not hearing your.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, Leslie Gallinger had a question for you. She says, I see your concerns as part of the NERC mandate to oversee risk reduction, reliability, and security of the grid. You seem to express in your presentation that they are not doing enough. Is that correct? What else could they be doing?
Oh, sure. Well, for one thing, if NERC were to be trusted, you know, they could insist that the U.S. FERC have a standard for nuclear EMP, the E1 EMP that we were talking about before. I mean, here it is. It's more than a year after President Trump signed his executive order to protect our grid and other critical infrastructures against electromagnetic pulses, including nuclear EMP attack. And there isn't even a standard for protecting against the E1 EMP. The E3 EMP, the kind of EMP that can be generated by the sun, the natural EMP, is only 8 volts per kilometer. And that's what Canada has as a result of the 1989 Hydroquebec storm. So basically, they want to do what Canada has done up to this point. But as I told you, we know that a geomagnetic superstorm like the Carrington event is inevitable, and it's going to happen someday. The standard really should be 24 volts per kilometer for both Canada and the United States. So they're just dragging their feet, and they just seem to be doing everything that they can, you know, you know, they want to do endless studies, you know, go back and re-examine these things like EPRI is doing, you know, to try to let themselves off the hook so that they don't have to do anything, basically. This has been their standard operating procedure for a long time. They could be following the examples of some of the really praiseworthy utilities in the United States. Not all of the utilities follow the lead of NERC. The American Electric Power, for example, I mean, they're the 3rd largest utility in the United States. On their own, they're actually hardening their own grid against EMP, both nuclear and natural EMP, and doing a pretty good job of it. I actually inspected, you know, some of their transformers and their control centers, and out of their own pocket, you know, they've been spending millions of dollars to do it, just out of social conscience and patriotism. NERC should be following the lead of some of the small number of utilities like American Electric Power that are doing the right thing.
Good, thank you very much. We're coming up to the top of the hour. We're going to have to wrap up the Q&A, and I'd just like to turn it over to Karsten for a couple of comments before I come back and officially wrap up. So Karsten, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Pry, for that highly informative session. And thank you for pointing out some of the things that we can do to protect ourselves. I'd also like to thank John Wilson, CEO Global Network, for having worked with us on this initial 4 session series of roundtables.